talking about responsible consumer-facing communication in the digital age. I'm Sophie Seck. I'm the Senior Manager for Ethics and Compliance at Medicines Australia, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Lucy O'Brien, and together we form the Code team, or known as the Codies, from inside Medicines Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that we have a fairly broad audience for today's info session, which means that you'll come together today with different base knowledges of the code, and you'll all be working in potentially different areas in the companies. But I'd just like to say that we've designed the content for someone who already understands what the code does, how to access the code, its scope, its intent, its purpose, and have some kind of familiarity with how it speaks to ethical decision making and interactions. So if you are new to industry or new to the code, there are plenty of other resources that we've got available to help upskill you quickly. I would like to acknowledge country before we start. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be joining us today. Lucy and I are on Ngunnawal country. Many of you won't be on Ngunnawal country. You'll probably be joining from Gadigal land or Wiradjuri country. But please feel free to acknowledge the country on which you meet in the chat box. And I would like to also just recognise the deep and enduring connection First Nations people have to this land, and their rich traditions in passing knowledge from one person to another, and also between generations. So in many ways, today's gathering, even though it's a webinar, it still reflects that knowledge sharing spirit, a moment of learning and collective capability building. Touch on housekeeping. You can email the Code Help Desk at any time. So Lucy and I are behind that email, and we've got a really quite elaborate, comprehensive and extensive code resource toolkit that's online that hosts a whole lot of resources and guidance that is your go-to. So this is a menu card, I suppose, of what we'll talk about today. I suppose I'd just like to acknowledge up front that that we're not discussing or bringing to you today anything that's brand new. So everything, like we did a Code Info session in 2022 on social media, and we did another one in 2024, which was on social media and influencers, and also writing media releases. And then with the introduction of Code Edition 20 earlier this year in March, we also did some work around through webinars, some changes of approach and some shifts that Code Edition 20 took in this space. So today we're synthesizing all those thoughts and all that advice and popping it into, what we hope is one concise package. So those who are already across all of that information, this is a chance to, I suppose, bed down your pre-existing knowledge. And for those who, didn't participate in 2022 and 2024, then this is a good opportunity to upskill. And before we, we'll hop into what the code says. So the code is our backbone. We'll then look at, the kind of decision making about when you can say something to consumers about product and how you would go about doing that. Then we'll kind of get a bit deeper and talk about consumer media, how to write, not so much how to write, but what to look out for in terms of making a media release, and how and the activities associated with that. And then we'll also do a similar deeper dive into social media, what kind of things to look out for when writing about writing to consumers through, and using social media as your platform, especially when it's related to a product. And a touch on media influencers or digital opinion leaders or spokespeople or the face of a disease awareness campaign, however you want to term that. We'll have a look at that, and we'll also hopefully have time for some Q&A at the end. But I will stop periodically throughout the session today to see if there are any questions. And before we get going, I just wanted to mention a caveat. What we talk about today is guidance. This Code Info session is an educational opportunity delivered to industry to help you and guide you in applying the code's principles into how you work. And in doing so, we think that it will help you avoid a complaint being made against your company for any unethical decisions that you may unintentionally make. But our advice does not replace what's written in the code. It's responsibility of every company to make those decisions for yourself. And the Code of Conduct Committee, of which I'm not on, is the only authority in making any binding decisions on code compliance. So this is independent of Medicines Australia. So it's just a bit of a caveat to be aware of. So let's kick off. What does the code say? The code doesn't look like that at all anymore, but nonetheless, worth having a look. So the code starts with relevant overarching principles, and they are overarching, meaning that they are broad, and you shouldn't really go ahead and conduct an activity without thinking about those overarching principles. And the ones that are relevant to today's topic are overarching principles 3, 6, and 10, particularly 3 and 6. So overarching principle 3, companies are responsible for providing current, accurate, balanced, and scientifically valid information. This actually applies to all company communication, so it's not designed only to cover promotional material going to healthcare professionals. And the key word there is balanced. It ultimately, so any way that you talk about a product needs to be balanced. And if it's not balanced, then we would suggest it will probably feel and be perceived to be promotional. So that's a key overarching principle. The other one is 6, companies' interactions are consistent with all legislative requirements and appropriate to the information needs of the respective audience. So by the legislative requirements, we are referring to the Therapeutic Goods Act and the prohibition of promoting therapeutic goods to a consumer audience. So that's what we're referring to there, and appropriate to the information needs of the respective audience. That's acknowledging that what you would say about a product to a healthcare professional will probably be different to how you would communicate that same content or a refinement of that content to consumer media, which would also be slightly different potentially to the way that you communicate that same intent to the public. So tailoring and crafting messaging according to the audience is key. And all activities undertaken by companies are identified to their audience. That's pretty much of a no-brainer in this case. Obviously, it just means that we need to be upfront that we're making that communication, or we have employed a company to make that communication on our behalf, or we have employed a spokesperson to talk about that communication on our behalf. So we need to be clear and transparent. And of course, never forgetting overarching principle 1, that all activities by our industry have the purpose of supporting the quality use of medicines. So it would be amiss of me to start going into the detail without just having a quick reminder about the definition of promotion, because that is it's the elephant in the room, really. It is the key, it's the key risk in talking to consumers directly, especially when you're going to be announcing a new product, etc. It is the thing that we need to avoid, and there are so many complexities associated with that. So this is the definition of how the code defines promotion. It is consistent with the way that the Therapeutic Goods Act defines advertisement. So there is consistency there, and that's intentional. The code not only uses this definition, but it goes on to define what promotional claim is and what promotional material is. So it's quite extensive. But we don't need to, I suppose we don't want to do the whole session about the definition of promotion, but I just wanted to make sure it's there up front. And how that impacts us is that when we're communicating to the wider world, we shouldn't be encouraging the use of a product. We should be avoiding presenting any positives of a product. And if it is included in the material for a valid reason, then they need to at the very least, be balanced with safety and risk information, depending on the relevant context. And also, obviously, don't include any statements on efficacy, so no claims, no rates of, adverse effects, or any other cautionary aspects of the product and comparative information, unless it's required, depending on the context. So there's some kind of key principles to think about. And I just circled those pink circles are there just to kind of, I suppose, remind ourselves that the prohibition of promoting or advertising a product, it doesn't necessarily extend to every single thing we do. So there is all the science, all the R&D, the research and development that happens before, in creating a molecule, and then that molecule turning into a drug candidate that turns into a drug that then potentially turns into a medicine that, is then prescribed. Like, there's all that kind of legwork that has to happen prior to anything becoming a therapeutic product. And sometimes I feel that, we might be coming from, if we're coming from a very conservative base, we shy away from talking about the science behind our innovation, because we might be thinking that we're promoting that science. And I suppose I just wanted to address that and say that there's nothing, the code itself and the Therapeutic Goods Act doesn't talk about not talking about science. It's really related to not promoting a therapeutic product. So there, just to be mindful that there can be ways of communicating the work that we do before something becomes a therapeutic product. So it's a nice segue, I suppose, to clarify, like the non-promotional approach only applies to prescription medicine. So put that aside, there are many ways that we can promote and advertise things. We can advertise our company, or promote our company. We can talk about our brand. We can talk about our workplace culture, the corporate social responsibility initiatives that we're doing. We can talk about the people that we work with, the collaboration, our partnerships. We can talk about our individual values, our company values, our policies, and how they intersect with the world. We obviously know that we're empowered to initiate and fund disease awareness activities, to raise attention to medical conditions that could affect the Australian, or do affect the Australian public. And we can also promote our commitment to improving the quality of life for patients, because patients are the beneficiaries of our medicine, and that is the reason why we do what we do. And I have popped in bold there, we should and can also highlight and communicate our investments into innovation, research and science. So this is, I suppose, this is the area that we do that other people and other companies don't. This is the niche that we are in, and this is the value that we offer the world. So there's many ways that we can talk about that without crossing that boundary of promoting a therapeutic product. And also we can advocate for better processes. As you can see, and hopefully it's come to you in one way or the other, but we're currently advocating for a stronger PBS and speeding up patient access to new medicines that can improve or even save lives. So that's some of the advocacy that we do as Medicines Australia, but as companies you are able to do as well. So examples, I suppose, just to put that into a visual for you. These are totally fake, mocked up by my wonderful colleague Lucy. You know, you could talk about your environmental initiatives and, you know, your ESG policies and anything that you're doing as a company to improve sustainability and the environment. You could talk about diversity in your workplace. You could talk about celebration of Harmony Day, or you know, anything that talks about the diversity of your people and celebrates the diversity of your people. You could profile the new people that you've employed and the experience that they have and what they bring to industry and to your company. And then this is kind of a little bit along the side of the science and research. You could talk about, you know, maybe the new technologies like mRNA vaccines and how they're influencing innovation and extending their reach into therapeutic areas, and how you're working in that space. You could talk about your commitment to clinical trials and the science behind the work that you do. And then you could also highlight some disease awareness activities, profiling some conditions, or especially raising awareness about conditions and not so much treatments, but conditions and diseases that maybe haven't had the awareness profile that they have had previously. There's a big spotlight right now on menopause. Now that's probably coming to me because of the profile that I am, but and endometriosis and a lot of women's health issues that may not have had the gusto that in the past, or maybe they have and they just didn't come to me because I was younger. But those kind of things are really useful. So because it's pretty early, I thought I'd just throw you a bone and see if you could, in light of what I've kind of talked about, I thought that I've posted two options up there, A and B. They both have the same, they both say the same thing in different language. So they're both potential social media posts with the accompanying image. And my question to you, and we'll do a poll, is as a pharmaceutical company employee, so as industry, which of those, if any, would you be happy sharing, engaging with, posting, liking on, you know, on your social media? Let's take a critical view of A. Just for a second, we talk about a drug in A, and we talk about a molecule in B. You know, there's probably strict definitions of either, but a drug is closer to a prescription medicine. A molecule is very much better down in the science. In A, we talk about reversing the XYZ effect, and B, we talk about our work in reversing the XYZ effect. So there's a certainty in A that's starting to sound like a claim. And B, it's more like the work to with that intent. In A, we talk about a specific trial phase with positive results, which is clearly not balanced by adding a very few side effects. So that's a classic case of over-egging the good and under-baking the bad. It also, A talks about, it's kind of emotionally framed. So it's really going for promise, hope, and anticipation for it to become a viable prescription medicine. And the closer it gets, I suppose, to becoming a registered therapeutic good, the closer it becomes to feeling like a promotional teaser for an unregistered medicine. And also you've got the image. The image is clinical, and in B, the image is very much in the lab. So it's really trying to celebrate the work that we do, but say it in a way that is not certain. It acknowledges that that there's no, I suppose it acknowledges that there's an investigational nature of the work and it's not certain, there's no claims and no results. So thanks, guys. Just going back to the code, today we're focusing really on section 10. Section 10 has 3 subsections, section 10, 10.1 and 10.2. Section 10 is formally section 11. So if you haven't yet got your head around edition 20, it's the same, it's just section 10. It recognises the need for meaningful engagement with a wide range of stakeholders. So whilst the Therapeutic Goods Act, divides and says this audience here, healthcare professionals and a couple other people can receive promotional material and everybody else cannot. The world is slightly more complex than that kind of black and white 2-bucket approach. And the purpose of section 10 really is to set some broad principles to guide companies in ensuring such engagement, those engagement with those stakeholders, does remain ethical and non-promotional. Section 10.1 is the new bit. So it wasn't in Code Edition 19. It relates specifically to product-focused communication made to consumers through the media. Now, public announcements about a company's product are, they're high profile and they're high risk. So the Code Review Working Group, as well as members as a whole, felt strongly that clear parameters were needed to ensure that those statements are made responsibly and appropriately. So hence the reinsertion of 10.1. And section 10.2 really includes just general principles about social media. So it's specific to social media, but it's not specific to products. So if you were to make a statement using social media about a product, you would look at both 10.1, because you're making a statement about a product through media, as well as looking at section 10.2 and not forgetting the overarching principles. Let's look at the when and how of product communication. And section 10.1 is really what this is built for. It's designed to try and help companies understand when it's appropriate to make a statement and what to think of when they're doing so. So edition 18 was quite prescriptive. The guidelines actually, as you can see up there, it says that the announcements of a new product, a new indication or PBS listing are the only circumstances in which you can make a media release for lay media. So that was quite specific. It was actually in the guidelines, but it was exclusive. It was very detailed, and it didn't really allow anything else. Edition 19 was open-ended. It was silent on this issue, and it allowed companies to decide on when it's appropriate. And then we would suggest that, well, I'm calling edition 20 suggestive. So we go, I suppose, back to the future and have reinserted some of the detail from edition 18 into edition 20. So in our view, the outcome is a hybrid of both approaches. It outlines some suitable points in time for making a product-specific announcement, but it does so in a way that doesn't limit other options. So in this way, it allows companies to follow a proven path while still providing the flexibility to make your own decisions. So when are those moments or those milestones? The main ones you should focus on are the new registration, new approved indication, new public funding, or a change in public funding. And then the others in blue, product safety, shortages, recalls or withdrawals, they can be made in consultation with the TGA. So if you were to consider other moments beyond those 4, we would suggest some good hard thinking about the nature and the intent of any such announcement. Is it a genuine development that is relevant for the public? and if so, and why. Each company must assess whether other situations justify consumer-facing statements and be prepared to justify their relevance and necessity if promotional concerns arise. So one of the ones that we see a lot, and we definitely understand why they're done, and in my view should be done, is the invitation to our wider stakeholders and consumers to make comment on PBAC submissions. So that's very much that mechanism by the PBAC to invite consumer comments is done for a purpose, not for the purpose of being quiet about it and not being able to amplify that message. So that's one example that's a fairly well-trodden path that is not listed in the code, but seems to suit those parameters. So if you are in the position of trying to decide whether your statement or whether the reason that you want to talk about something is appropriate, these are some of the questions that you might like to ask yourself. So relevance is key. I've just mentioned that before. Is it educational? So by educational, we're talking about not being persuasive, not being overly positive. Is it neutral? Is it fact-based? Is it informative? Have we prioritised the healthcare professional community? So obviously they are our primary stakeholders. They are the people that need to know, firstly, about our medicines and any new medicines, any change in funding, etc. So have we made reasonable steps to inform them in the first instance prior to making a public announcement? A nod to the disclosure commitments for any company that's listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. They will have obligations to make certain announcements that other companies will not have. So in this way, the code, I suppose their disclosure obligations under the stock exchange trump the code in that respect. So if you do need to make an announcement to meet those disclosure obligations, then you would clearly do so. And the TGA have some really useful guidance on their website about how to do that, considering it's not a usual situation. So how to do so without making it feel like it's promoting potential new therapeutic goods, for example. You wouldn't make any statement about an unapproved product. So it really needs to only relate to the consumer world when we're talking about. It should only relate to approved products or indications. And, just the perennial question, is it defendable? How would we defend it? So if prompted, can you adequately defend your approach and demonstrate that rationale for making that statement? So apply risk-based decision-making. And it's probably worth noting, we'll say, like, what's the probability of a complaint being made and who would make it? And, if you are posting something or communicating something to the wide world, you are going to the wide Australian world, you are going to a broad audience. If a person, an individual consumer, does feel like this is promotion or an advertisement, they can make a complaint. And with our complaints process, individuals don't, there's no mandate on individuals undertaking intercompany dialogue or dialogue with a company. So it can go straight through to the code committee if there's validity in their complaint. So companies shouldn't rely on being able to defend that approach to the person making a complaint. They may not be afforded the opportunity of that dialogue pre-code committee. So it's just something to keep in mind. So what to say and how to say it. So let's look at the two main ways that communication reaches the public. You've got the indirect way, so through consumer media, where the company shares information with journalists, and those journalists then decide if it's newsworthy and what content to publish or if to publish. In this model, the media acts as a filter or conduit to the Australian public. And then you've got the direct model. So using the company's own channels, such as social media or corporate platforms. Here there is no filter. The company decides what to share and how to share it. And in both cases, the end result is the same, that the Australian public receives that information. The key difference, though, lies in responsibility and risk. So with consumer media, the one on the left, companies are accountable for what they provide to the media, but they are not accountable then to how the media report on it. So as the code states, companies cannot control the final output of media coverage. In contrast, when communicating directly, the second option, the company does hold full responsibility for both the message and any subsequent perception or impact. So the similarities, though, between both approaches are that any product-specific communication, whether through consumer media or direct channels, should comply with Section 10.1. So this includes strict requirements on what that messaging must include, what that messaging may include, and what that messaging must not include. I might do a quick poll. I've got a question for you. If a company has a medicine that is newly listed on the PBS, can it communicate this news via both methods, direct and indirect, or does it need to choose one? Is it going too far to use both methods? The code says you can use both. There is nothing that limits the way a company chooses to make an announcement in terms of directly or indirectly, as long as it is done in one single coordinated manner, not a drip feeding over time. So if you make it once, there is no need to minimize that announcement to one channel or one platform. The idea is, as you can see, there's not many times in a product life cycle you would ever make an announcement about that product. So when you're making that, there's no need to limit it to one method, as long as it's just done well, concisely, and in one single coordination, I suppose, action. So the answer is yes, it can. So just to illustrate that kind of concept, you've got the type of package that, as you can see on the screen, that's prepared for consumer media. So you'll have probably a 2-page media release. You might have a follow-up call. You'll have an email that attaches the media release. You'll have maybe an image of a spokesperson, maybe an accompanying image for something else, not a pack shot. And such a package usually provides a fairly extensive amount of detail so that that media outlet can decide on what is relevant and newsworthy. So what are the bits and pieces that it wants to run? That package is written for journalists. It's not written for the public. And it relies on the media to exercise that editorial judgment about what information should be shared and more widely. And then this may result in coverage, for example, or sometimes it won't result in any coverage at all. But either way, that resulting coverage remains outside your responsibility, as we've just suggested. The other option we talked about was the direct communication through a company's own platforms. These messages are typically brief, they are focused, and they're written for the public to easily understand. And the overall effect of both methods is that the Australian public can now access that information. Now, if you consider the differences carefully, like a press release with the level of detail on it that's usually designed for consumer media is not designed to directly distribute to the public. If a company proactively shares that media release, it risks being perceived as promotional. And I'm talking about proactively sharing with the direct public rather than proactively sharing with consumer media. So this marks a shift from our previous approach. We didn't go that far during Code Edition 19. So while the code does not explicitly prohibit or permit that that proactive distribution of a press release to the public, our advice is not to do it, is to avoid it. It just has the higher potential for it to be interpreted as promotion in a public context. And it's written for a different audience, and that goes back to that overarching principle. Looking overseas, which we do regularly because thankfully there are limited complaints in Australia. We do learn a lot from our overseas counterparts, and because we've got quite a few international connections. One of the rulings that came from the UK had that quoted: "It is difficult to see how the proactive distribution of a press release about a medicine to an individual member of the public would meet all the requirements of Clause 26. Now, Clause 26 is the prohibition of advertisements of a therapeutic good to the public. So in terms of timing, a company can do both of those activities that are circled in a single coordinated manner. And that means, do them concurrently. Don't do them week after week, and then stop. Otherwise, it starts to feel like a campaign. And I would encourage you to pop in the chat box. What do you see as what's the time frame about a single coordinated manner? The code doesn't go that far to tell you a time frame, but obviously. The purpose behind the single coordinated manner is to ensure that you have one good, concise go, and then it stops. So an individual consumer doesn't get a continuation of the same content over and over again over a course of time. In terms of similarities between the direct and indirect approach is that they both need to satisfy 10.1. So whatever the format, the information needs to be balanced. And as you know, unbalanced statements may be considered promotional. So to ensure that those statements include some balance, just to make sure it's not over to you to make that judgment, 10.1E actually mandates the inclusion of a summary of the side effect profile, products, precautions, adverse effects, warnings, contraindications, and interactions. So not every subcategory must be covered. It's a summary. You can use your judgment. So it will depend on the product, it would depend on what those safety and risk information is, and it would depend on the context. So we would expect there to be more information in that summary on a 2-page media release than we would expect on a very concise, short message to directly through your social media platforms. And also just to be aware, we need to be mindful that the content that we're delivering is not prescribing information. We are not talking to healthcare professionals. That's not the intent of this communication. It must be relevant to consumers. And so, we do need to include enough information to ensure that balance. So let's hop into consumer media. So we're now looking at what kind of how you'd make a statement to consumer media and the activity that entails. And it's probably worth noting that companies are also responsible for materials prepared by PR agencies or communications agencies engaged by them. So just to tease out the bit of the code that says what needs to be included. So as you can see, all those things need to be included in that statement. When we're talking about the approved indications relevant to the product-specific media statement, that might not mean copying and pasting verbatim everything in the PI or the CMI in this particular instance. It should be only relevant to the purpose of the product statement. Also, when it comes to therapeutic class, we would suggest you don't need to be dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Broad familiar terms for a consumer audience for a therapeutic class would be acceptable. So something saying that it's in the diabetes area would suffice instead of saying metabolic disorder, for example, we would suggest. And also a copy or link of the product CMI is required. And when we say a copy of or a link to, our general advice is use the same medium. So if you're sending this digitally, then use a URL or hyperlink for that CMI. And if you're using print, then a QR code or an attachment might be the best way. In terms of may include, this is optional, a non-comparative description of the mechanism of action. And by that we mean, explaining what the medicine does and how it works. So, for example, the medicine lowers blood pressure by relaxing blood vessels, allowing the blood to flow more easily. As opposed to, this treatment is proven to lower blood pressure, helping blood flow smoothly and improving health. So that's just gives you a sense of saying the same thing, but one's clearly been twisted to be promotional and encouraging, and the other one is sitting there more as a neutral statement. And obviously there's a whole section on what a product statement cannot include, and I'll get to those in a bit. So these are kind of grabs, I suppose, from the notes from the help desk, of which we have one on our interactive code that does give you an example of a media statement, and it highlights the bits and pieces in the statement that fit the code. I would like to draw your attention to a referral to a treating clinician. See if I can use my pointer. I think here it says treatment options should be discussed with a patient's clinician. Brand name is an Australian registered prescription medicine and can only be prescribed by a doctor. And then include a brief disclosure of any relationship between the company and the spokesperson. So you've got here, this is a spokesperson, Dr. Marjorie Expert, has been put forward in this media statement, and it explains that no compensation was provided. However, this expert does receive consultancy fees for other work. And references are not mandatory, but they do support accuracy and transparency. So that's an example of the references. So those little pointers that I just brought to your attention are not in the code. They're not a requirement under 10.1. But they are definitely a company spokesperson relationship is expected in the spirit of transparency. References, that's up to you. And referral to a clinician isn't required, but there are many ways of saying something that does respect that healthcare professional-patient relationship being the key decision maker, rather than us as a company being the key decision maker. And avoid using the term TGA approved. The TGA says that it definitely bans it from being used in advertisements. Now, this is not an advertisement, so arguably it doesn't apply, but ultimately the thought behind it is that to a consumer, it might give someone the impression that that product has endorsement or by the TGA, when actual fact the TGA has just approved the fact that it's or that it does what it says it's doing and is safe enough to use. So yeah, I've tried to avoid using TGA approved in consumer facing information. And a little bit more, so just to highlight the whole package. So media release might be consistent with the code, but maybe the email that accompanies it might be encouraging. Or maybe the imagery might be promotional, or the interview with journalists by the spokesperson might be promotional. So that will throw the entire package or the entire interaction into a promotional context. And that was subject to a complaint about 10 years ago, where the actual media release was determined to be compliant, but the way that it was communicated via email to the media was definitely promotional. So just the nature of that email threw the whole thing into the spotlight. So just consider all the elements. And in terms of the broad audience, I think I've mentioned that, you can't control I'll talk about actually the website and housing the media releases in the next couple of slides. But the proactive or reactive nature, so you can proactively reach out to consumer media, or you can wait for consumer media to ask you questions. Both are fine. And I've also mentioned the limited opportunities, so single coordinated release across multiple channels, and that's the reference to the fact that it's not limited to just to one. In terms of distribution and placement, so avoid direct distribution to the public. We've talked about that. Consider the whole package. We've talked about that. And limited opportunity, we've also talked about that. So hopefully that's well and truly bedded down. In terms of housing the media statements, housing them on a corporate website, we believe is appropriate, preferably under a tab or a indication that is housing all content that's designed for media to access. So a tab, for example. We would consider this as not proactively sharing. You're not pushing out this to consumers. You are housing a non-promotional source on your website. So there's a difference, I suppose, between housing a media release on a website as opposed to directing people to it through a social media post. Complaint 1172 is quite a few years ago now, but it did prompt caution amongst industry, and some companies chose to remove those product-specific statements to manage the risk of visibility and potentially other companies holding them to account. So that's your decision, but there's nothing in the code or no ruling by the code committee that suggests that housing those press releases on your corporate website is inappropriate. And retaining it as an enduring piece of information on your website is not considered repeated issuing. So you've done a single coordinated release and now you're just housing it somewhere that's accessible as an enduring resource. It's not counted as a continual issuing. And focus on content, really. That's the emphasis, rather than the location is not as really important as to where it's housed. If the content is deemed non-promotional, is balanced, legitimate, genuine news, then housing it on your website should not be a problem. In terms of content and what to avoid, so don't use promotional statements or language, which you would all know. So that means no sensationalism, and also avoid emotive language. So using lots of adjectives or statements that are emotional, so life-changing, breakthrough, impressive, transformative, obliterating disease, miracle, anything like that is generally going to be perceived as not having the intent of just making an announcement. In addition, ensure all imagery is not promotional. We've obviously talked about no pack shots, but there could be other imagery that may shift what would otherwise be a non-promotional media release into something that is trying to encourage the positive attributes of a product. And also avoid using or referencing a company patient support program. So the code does ban the reference to a product access program. It doesn't talk about banning or not including reference to a company patient support program, but we have written a notes from the help desk on that. And they are quite, relatively similar in the fact that they don't really hold, it's not the legitimate right place to accompany a new product. It's really information that's only important to patients who have already been prescribed that product. And it's probably more appropriate for that to be delivered through the healthcare professional rather than be suggested in combination with the announcement of a new product. It kind of lends itself a little bit to patient-led prescribing. And no results, so no clinical trial results, and that might change if you have disclosure obligations. And examples of what could be promotional, I'll just pop that there. These are examples that have come from previous complaints, but that have been manipulated in a way that, you know, are generalised. So I do have a question for you. This statement, hundreds of Australians living with this often life-threatening disease can now be offered a treatment to prolong time in remission. Is that statement promotional in your view? Noting that it is factual. There are hundreds of Australians with this disease. The disease is life-threatening, and there now will be, well, the introduction of this new medicine will be available to treat, and it is designed to prolong time in remission. I suppose I always find this, I just want to highlight that something can be factual but still promotional. Sometimes people say, well, it's publicly available and it's a fact, so therefore we can say it. I suppose if I was to post right here another alternative, I wonder, that Australians diagnosed with this condition may now have access to a treatment option that has been shown to extend time in remission, is another way of saying the same thing. It is also factual. It also delivers the same information, or similar information, but it doesn't evoke that sense of urgency and hope, and it doesn't frame the treatment positively or overly positively. It just is a bit more neutral and factual, and non-promotional. So my answer is, I suggest that question to you that I put to you is promotional, and that there are different ways of framing the same thing. In terms of complaint outcomes, like what we've learned, so this comes from a breach back in 10 years ago now. Combining the treatments in one single device is a key step forward in disease management. So the Code Committee chose or viewed this as promotional because the words key step forward inferred a superiority of the combination product, rather than having each treatment without it being combined. So they did rule that statement to be promotional. In addition, there was a complaint 2 years ago, which the media statement publicly referenced an access program, and the answer was from the Code Committee that it was not appropriate and it could have the effect of driving inappropriate patient-led prescribing, which consolidates the advice I've just given. And another complaint, again, a breach, because, you know, we learn from our mistakes. Why in combination with chemotherapy prolongs the time patients battling X remain in remission compared to chemotherapy alone. So once again, the statement was promotional because it encourages patients to seek treatment with Y in addition to chemotherapy. So it was kind of more like encouraging patient-led prescribing, or at least the committee believed so. Now, you're not privy to the entire context of those complaints, and I have just cherry-picked them. So a word of caution, there's probably a bit more to it. But either way, I thought that could be interesting to pop out there, some of the statements that we've made. And in the past. And briefing spokespeople is ultimately your responsibility. So if a healthcare professional or other stakeholder speaks to media and you've put them forward to do so, you're responsible for what they say. And to help with this responsibility, ensuring that spokesperson is properly briefed on the Therapeutic Goods Act and the code is critical. So there was a complaint made, again, 10 years ago, where the patient spokesperson talked about their positive experiences with the medication, and that threw the company into breach. And when the when the company demonstrated that they had, in fact, briefed that spokesperson. So, potentially they haven't actually done anything wrong. Potentially the patient spokesperson went rogue, for want of a better word, which does happen. It could, I suppose, when the committee looked at that briefing document, it was done in a way that that was too broad and too general to really give that spokesperson enough structure and understanding about what they should or shouldn't speak about. So it said something like that spokesperson may express your own opinion and discuss your own experiences with medicines as you choose. But when sharing your story or responding to questions, it needs to be balanced and factual. Like that wasn't enough to guard against that. I suppose that interaction. So that's the end of the consumer media section. I might just dive straight into social media at the moment because time is of essence. We do have some really good resources in our interactive code. One is on, obviously, guidance for industry. It dropped in April, so it's fairly new and it's all on social media. And there's another one, Notes from the Help Desk 85, which talks about product-specific social media and adapting to Code Edition 20. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at those if you haven't already. They do include some examples, such as this one, just posted there for your visibility, and it tries to map those code elements to a social media mock-up that's obviously kind of fake news. I would like to just bring up something that's of interest. So we did talk before about referring to a treating clinician. It is not a mandatory requirement in section 10.1. So if you're making a product announcement, you do not have to talk about a treating clinician. In this case, we don't really want, so we need to avoid promotional language. So phrases like see your doctor to see if this medicine is right for you can shift the tone in a social media context, the direct link from company to person, towards consumer promotion. So it's not the intent of the communication. We don't want the consumer to give the consumer a call to action to run to the doctor to discuss whether that medicine is right for them. That's starting to shift it towards a promotional intent. So it's not a disease awareness campaign. It's a general public announcement that there is a new development, a new funding model, or a new medicine available, but it's not an invitation for consumers to seek treatment. So we suggest keeping it factual. It's acceptable to state that a product is a prescription medicine. However, encouraging action from consumers risks undermining the non-promotional nature of the message. So maybe there's a middle ground, like maybe you could say only a healthcare professional can determine the appropriateness of this treatment, which is not a call to action for a consumer. But, because it's one, not required, and two, the social media context is very concise, often with limited characters or limited words that you can use. It's possibly easier just to not state that at all. So this is kind of where context is key. Paid spend. Social media enables precise audience targeting. If that content, the content that you're creating, if it's appropriate for consumers, then you might justify paid promotion. Paid promotion by itself does not equal turning something into a promotion. So there's nothing that the code says about paid spend, and I would suggest that it could be done in certain situations. But the context matters. So you need to assess the risk. Boosting that content can increase visibility and repetition. So that's probably what you want at the very beginning, but it's probably not what you want when we're talking about a single coordinated communication. So it may raise concerns about perceived promotion if that paid spend starts to continually amplify and recurring that piece of information over time. And so with any risk, you know, we think about the ways to mitigate that. So evaluate how paid spend affects the exposure of your piece and take steps to ensure, you know, that those are mitigated accordingly. And commenting on and off as well. So enabling comments on social media does help boost engagement. That's the power of social media. It helps build community. It helps gather feedback. It helps, you know, it enhances the credibility of the post. It generates content ideas. It does so many wonderful things. But it does present a risk. So if it's not managed well, it could be the difference between a compliant social media post and that which is not compliant. Because ultimately, companies, as it's your post, you are responsible for any content that you disseminate via social media, and that includes the comments that are made in conjunction with that post, so underneath or in connection with that activity. So if you choose to enable comments, you know, have processes in place that you know, you might use a third party to do that, or you might you know, how you do that is really up to you. It might be your corporate services arm. It might be a different role that you have in the company. But either way, how you monitor is your decision. Processes should monitor. They should moderate, and where possible, they should delete any inappropriate comments in a timely manner. Now, you know, I planted the seed of what timely manner is before. Now, what kind of comments could they be? They could be racist comments. They could be comments that target or marginalise others. They could spruik a person's experience with the off-label use of a product or refer to a non-registered product. The words in the code are that it does not conform to community standards or ethics and good taste. Sorry, community standards of ethics and good taste, or which relates to unapproved products or indications. So what do we mean by promptly? Like, being a principles-based code, we don't go into the detail. I don't want to come up with a figure, because then it's me coming up with a figure that's not in the code. Back in edition 18, we did have the expectation in the guidelines seemed to be 24-hour period of monitoring, like a 24-hour cycle. I would suggest that we've moved past 24 hours, as in we've got tighter. Things get viral overnight. And I think potentially now we have the opportunity to stop comments when we can't monitor, and we enable comments when we can. So instead of enabling comments and only looking at them 24 hours later, because many platforms offer that ability, I would suggest that it's much tighter than a 24-hour period. Ultimately, the longer you have between monitoring comments, the greater the risk that that your post is sitting there with something that's not right. And why disable comments? So limiting comments to a short predefined period helps mitigate the risk of content being perceived as promotional. It controls engagement levels. It maintains messaging consistency if you disable the comments, and it minimises, how much you have to moderate. We also thought that maybe if you're putting out a post that's asking for PBAC comments or comments to the PBAC process, that maybe an individual in the wide world may not understand what that means on face value, and maybe what they might understand that to be is make a comment to this post about this particular drug or medicine, which is not what you want. So, our advice in that's a case of context is key. Potentially, if you're amplifying the opportunity for PBAC commentary, you disable the comments on that post just because of the increased chance of that being misunderstood. Liking and sharing. So we're responsible for what we share. Liking and sharing are intentional actions. Liking is not private. It notifies the content's author. So that's the red dot, the red dice there. It does three things. It pings the author of the content that you liked their stuff. It plugs that content that you liked to other people in your network, depending on the algorithm of the platform. and it slots in that like or that activity under your profile. So the 3 Ps. And that's why it's not like a neutral private activity. It actually does have a proactive nature about it. So what's a simple way of deciding on whether to share? If that content could be developed by your company and meets the requirements of the code, and you feel that with all the knowledge that you have and training that you have inside your company, that your company PR people would be really happy to have developed that themselves, then we suggest it's probably safe to share, like, engage, comment. But if it's not something that you feel that your company would develop or that you would develop yourself, then we would suggest refraining from interacting with that post. That's kind of a nice, very basic yardstick to make a decision before you start pressing on that phone that we all have. And just also to be aware of who we represent professionally. So, I mean, sometimes I just think I'm just Sophie. I'm Sophie now. I'm not representing Medicines Australia, but on LinkedIn I am actually representing Medicines Australia. I have, the profile I have because of my position, and other people will are cognizant of my role, and that also applies to yourself. So whilst it might feel sometimes like a private thing, if on a professional platform, if people do associate you with the role that you play in industry, then you are ultimately representing your company. And so it's really important to not think about the way we engage with social media to be a private activity. Test cases from the UK. Again, we don't really have many complaints that relate to the Australian context. So I have gone overseas to look for some, and it's always good to learn. It doesn't mean that the way that they prosecute a complaint will be the same way that our code committee will prosecute a complaint, but always be aware, informed and aware is probably the best position. So there was one complaint where this is actually quite a predictable, and maybe not predictable. This is a common mistake that has been made over the years, but it's interesting that this one was actually only published less than a year ago, so it's still being made. And it's when an individual that's working for a company likes or shares a post that's come from a whole different jurisdiction, and most often in the US, where they can say much more, and which has therefore promoted and propagated that kind of information to their networks, which translates to promoting that prescription medicine, whether it's unlicensed or licensed, to their network. Also, there was another one that was on formerly Twitter or on X, where there was a tweet about that phase 3 study of our vaccine candidate has met all primary efficacy endpoints. Now, that itself doesn't sound too promotional, but in the context of this scenario, the language, the location, the layout, and the intended audience and overall impression gave the committee or their equivalent that they decided that what was suitable for a press release, so that they thought that potentially that could have gone to a press release in package of a wider material, it was not suitable for a social media post. And it was along with other statements promoting unlicensed medicine to the public. And there was a last one, well, there's actually many, but this one is about promoting an unlicensed medicine to the public on LinkedIn. It did relate to an investigational molecule, so it was kind of harking back a bit about that science aspect that I talked about. But the panel, the committee, noted the early stage of development of the molecule. No application for a license had been submitted. It was many years away. The molecule was still referred to by a number, so molecule XYZ 103. And accordingly, the panel did not consider that investigation molecule could be considered a medicine at the time of posting. So it was very much in the science domain and not in promoting an unregistered medicine. And I suppose it's just really worth just, when you do enter the complaints world of the UK and the PCMPA, it's really the importance of employee training, both from a company and an individual perspective, is just really, really key. So, that everyone has their defined roles and responsibilities. They should have clear policies outlining an employee and contractor responsibilities when engaging on social media. There should be an approval and delegation process. They shouldn't just cover content decisions, but who approves the posts and who can post. An acknowledgement that private accounts still carry risk, that training is critical. And, we see this through monitoring, our monitoring activities as well, that a policy is only effective if it's understood and applied. So regular training helps embed those expectations and runs responsible behaviour. So any way that you can give a policy, you can wrap a policy out with the culture and the training and give it colour and movement, and make sure that that's not, once every 2 years, that's kind of regular. Then you're, as a company and an individual, you're going to be better off. And of course, there's always the pharmacovigilance compliance aspect. So there was another interesting complaint that came from the UK. A company employee liked and loved posts that were deemed to be effectively promoting prescription medicines to the public. But in looking at this, the panel wrote that the company appeared to provide all the right training, and they had clear company policies. They had clear expectations, and in this case, they considered that the company had ultimately been let down by that single employee. So the company had done as many of all the empowering right pieces, but in this case, that employee just didn't follow the rule book. Now, we don't want to be that employee, and we don't, but it just acknowledges that the importance of training, not only for companies, but also for individuals. And on the other side, there was another aspect where a different complaint where the panel suggested that the company's mandatory social media policy training, in this particular case of a breach, was more than a month overdue. So they really, they went a bit harder on the company because the company wasn't doing as much as it should have, or as it had expected itself to do in equipping its people to make the right decisions. Golly gosh, I've run out of time. I can't believe it. Media influencers are really just, the word influencers is just, it kind of turns people off, because we are not in the business of influencing our products to consumers in any way. So it's not the classic influencer that we see that's spruiking a over-the-counter product. But in this case, it's the face. It's providing an opinion leader, someone who can speak to a campaign, like a disease awareness campaign. They are really, really quite powerful. They are authentic. They have the storytelling ability, and they can also combat misinformation. And that bit in pink there that you see is a quote from a company managing director who did use an influencer to profile their disease awareness campaign, saying that we want to be able to meet patients where they're looking for this information, and it happens to be on social media. So they're going to find the people that have something to say and learn from each other. I will probably go over another 5 minutes. I totally understand if you have to drop off, but I'll just hopefully just at the tail end of this session. Online influencers and digital opinion leaders, they may take various forms. They might be consultancies, they might be collaborations, they might be partnerships. Ultimately, here are some tips and tricks. Firstly, internal guidelines to ensure that your personnel understands the risks, the benefits, and the processes to follow when engaging influencers. Well, any company-sponsored activity needs to be transparent to the viewer. So if you're putting up someone to be the spokesperson or the face of a disease awareness campaign and you've paid them, you should it should be known to the viewer that it's that transparency piece, that that person is being sponsored to say this, or that person is being funded by this initiative, started by this company. So we're not pretending that we're just being upfront about that relationship. And that's one of the critical elements of using a spokesperson. Also, in terms of going back to fair remuneration, we don't publish fair market value for influencers, but we do need to acknowledge that the money that you would pay a healthcare professional to be the face of a campaign may differ from their clinical rates. So they're providing a different service, I suppose, and what they may charge or what you may pay them will depend on the audience that you're trying to reach. It might depend on the levels of engagement in their posting and the numbers that follow them. So it's kind of a different service in this case. And documenting that approach will help you if you need to defend those payments in the future. All Medicines Australia members do make their payments to individual healthcare professionals transparent through our transparency reporting, and we would expect that to be captured there. So here are some, I trawled the internet. I didn't find too many spokespeople in the Australian context, so I did have to go overseas a bit. So if you know the names of any of those people that I've posted up there, and what they represent, or their activity and their partnerships in terms of speaking out about a particular disease, feel free to add them in the chat box. But really, before you engage an influencer, you really need to think about the need, define the message, know your audience, and then choose the influencer that works for that need. Don't do it the other way around. Alignment of values. So an influencer's impact will rely on their authenticity. Does the initiative genuinely reflect the values of that person? So it should be consistent with what they stand for and what they've talked about in the past. I still remember Shane Warne being pictured by the press at the back of the Cricket Pavilion having a smoke when he'd just done all this these advertisements for some nicotine patches. Like, clearly inconsistent values there, inconsistent behavior, and it kind of throws the whole thing down the drain. Due diligence before engaging, review their past posts, review what they stand for, review what they've said. Have a really good sense of who they are, because ultimately you're putting them forward to be the face of your disease awareness activity or something else. Brief them accordingly. Who's going to approve what they say? Do they approve what they say? How do you know that what they're saying is going to be fine? What about using hashtags? Who's going to monitor comments on their posts? Having all those conversations are really useful. And ultimately, as I mentioned, approvals, influencers do speak for your company. So you are responsible for how it is that they improved. And I'm not looking at the chat box because I'm so busy talking, but there's Ryan Reynolds. He was the face of a Parkinson's campaign in the US. I don't know how to say this lady's name. Julianne Hough. She partnered with a pharmaceutical company to raise awareness on endometriosis. Ida Buttrose, former ABC chair, and as you probably already know her, she's leads an educational initiative to inform older Australians on RSV. And then we've got awareness about shingles by Robert Dipper and Deborah Knight, if you're wanting to know who those people are. So they've all received and been part of a collaboration or some kind of activity where pharmaceutical industry has put them forward to be an influencer in their disease awareness campaigns. And that, I think, concludes today. So I'm really sorry I haven't been able to take any more questions, but and I'm sorry I went over time. Go straight to more information. Interactive code, code resource toolkit. The CEP exists for everyone and anyone. There's a bridging program out for edition 20. I love the emojis floating up on the screen. Thank you. Right back at you. And Lucy and I are always available 5 days a week. You can ask us a question, preferably via that Code Help Desk email. And thank you so much for attending today, donating your precious time to listen and learn. And we really hope you have a great end of week. Thanks, everyone.